what's next, right, in this model for training and learning. So, with a CEO that has a passion for this, I think, and with your background, it's definitely a winning team.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe sort of Back to the Future is the name of this podcast, maybe, because we should get to the book and the meat of the story, and it's absolutely along those lines of what's been happening and what's going to happen next when you apply learning to business. For folks who haven't read the book, I should probably just sketch out that it comprises of 3 sections. So it was published 10 years ago. That's kind of the headline. It's called The 2020 Workplace, and here we are now in 2020, which is kind of why we're talking about this. And there are sort of 3 sections. The first outlines what you thought at the time were the 10 forces at work on the workplace, digital, quite a lot about demographic trends and multiple generations in the workplace was big news at the time. Then the second section is essentially a set of case studies, which really kind of, I can see Jeannie sort of comes from your work and the great network that both of you have in the industry. And then the third was essentially 20 predictions for how the workplace was going to look in 2020. And we can definitely have some fun with that on the conversation. But I think the first thing that's interesting is, why did you think in 2010 that it was important to look 10 years into the future? And what techniques did you use to look into the future and gather these stories and predictions? So could you both talk a little bit about that?
I can look back at both of us, right, and say, I think while we didn't call ourselves workplace futurists at that point in time, we were both in our own respective careers intensely interested in the future. In this case, at first was learning, but it became broader of what's the future of working going to look like. What I think is interesting is when we wrote the book, the unemployment rate reached 13%, right? We were writing it in the middle of the Great Recession, and we were writing about the war for talent. But as you said, we were believers in the ebbs and flows of the economic cycle. It did take 2 years to write this book. And by the time we were out in the market in 2011 and 2012, things were making a turnaround. And I think, when you think back in 2008, people were just starting to talk about millennials, right? And I think our contribution at the time was to say, actually, there aren't just 4 generations in the workplace. There will be 5 generations working side by side. And this generational issue is one that HR leaders need to grapple with now. So we were looking at, yes, the war for talent, but more the changing composition of the workforce and what that means in terms of recruitment and retention of talent.
Karie, why do you think it's important to look into the future? Like, as a leader, was there something that motivated you to do this exercise from a sort of developing yourself as a CLO?
It kind of tying this just a tiny bit back to generations. If you think about, the world 11 years ago or so when we were writing this, the baby boomers were really running the corporations, right? And millennials are just coming into the workplace. And you looked at this, and Gen X is a much smaller generation, just demographically. So you from a CLO perspective, you look at, wow, there's going to be a big exodus of knowledge. And if you took every single Gen X and put them in a baby boomer job, you'd still run out of people, because it's going to be such an exodus. So we're going to have to start developing people earlier in order to be prepared. We're not going to have the same kind of thing that we had before. Life is going to change. So that was part one. And 28, 9, 10 is really interesting from a perspective of when social media first really came into widespread use. I mean, Instagram wasn't even invented until 2010. And, Facebook was the big technology at the moment. And Jeanne and I, both in our different areas of work, were realizing there's a lot of people that are in management now who don't get that life is going to change not only from a demographic perspective, but from how the employees of the future are really going to be using technology. And so it was like an inflection point in time, we thought, and one in which we needed to do a wake-up call for, in a sense, this is more of a wake-up call for baby boomers than it was a book for millennials.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I think why it resonated so much with HR at the time was that was the demographic sitting in senior roles in HR.
Yeah, I think it's I was going to mention it later, but I like the fact you have this sort of glossary of terms at the back, having to explain to people what Facebook is and what social media is. So I think it really, this, in that respect, it really looks like a sort of artifact of its time. Could you talk a little bit, either of you, about how you went about this? I know there are people who are futurists, and they look at edge stories and they have techniques that they use. It's not really about predicting things, is it?
Yeah. So we, in fact, I kind of glossed over a 4-year period at SAP where my title was Workplace Futurist. So I had the professional job title. It was really interesting for us to do that. So I think I would describe both Jeanne and myself as voracious readers. So we just started, I think, reading far more afield from our normal fields. And then we both have good networks. Jeanne has an extraordinary network. And we relied on networks. And so we would go to a network person and say, who else do you know that's doing something? We went to vendors and say, who do you know is doing the most advanced work in something? So we would just kind of bridge out that way. And then I got this unique use case for Twitter. So I keep an account that I never give out my name on, and it's kind of my research account. So whenever I see somebody writing about the future, I follow them on Twitter, because all writers will publish, hey, see my new article or see my new book. And so that Twitter feed only has people that are around the future or in my field or things like that. It's not a cluttered one. So I can go to it, once a month even, and just say, hey, what's come out in the last month now? But then I was like voraciously following. So Jeanne, can you think of other things that we were doing? Oh yeah, we did wild cards. Like, well, what if, because futurists do that, here's our best case scenario, but what if this unlikely scenario develops, what will the implications of that be, and so on. So we visited the Institute of the Future, other things. I mean, just lots of stuff.
Yeah, I think we got out of our comfort zone. We each have great networks of learning and HR people, but I think we made it a priority to reach out and develop new networks, right? That really fed into a new way of looking at the future workplace. So we were really on, for our time in 2008 and 2009, heavy users of social media back then as a way to find people doing interesting stuff. And, I found people on Twitter and went out and interviewed them, and they made their way into the book. So, yeah, it was an exciting time. And you're right, Chris, when you go back and look at some of the definitions, which we were strongly encouraged by our publisher to put in there, it's very humorous.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm gonna get back to that for sure. But I thought, like, for the core of this, we could do an exercise with the two of you about, these sort of 20 predictions. Pick one that you think you really got right and you really sort of nailed. Can you pick one that did not play out as you expected? And was there one thing that came along that had a kind of impact that you didn't foresee?
The mobile one. I think it was number 2. Your mobile device will become your office, your classroom, and your concierge. I don't think we anticipated at the time how big mobile was. We said there were 1.2 billion devices, and now they're about 5, and 70% of the population has a mobile. But I think it's, as you think through it, it's not just be a mobile first organization the way we were thinking in that prediction, but it's now much more being data driven and an AI powered organization where it's evolved. So my thinking is that each one of those, even the ones that I think we nailed, they're tweaking and moving in new directions. And then there was actually one in the book that didn't make the list of predictions, but was in another chapter on the democratization of information in the workplace. And I think that's huge when you think of the democratization of learning, of coaching. The pendulum has really swung very intensely from the employer to the employee. And so now nearly every aspect of life is being democratized. So I think we need to think of what are the ones we nailed, how are they shifting and moving, and then what did we refer to that we had actually no idea how big that was really going to be.
Yeah, it's super interesting. So mobile is just, I mean, it's just massive, and I think we all saw that coming, and but not to the extent that it's had an impact. One of the pieces of work that I've been doing is looking at learning in Africa, on the African continent, and really there was no digital learning at all until the cell phone came along, and the smartphone came along, and now the growth is just extraordinary. So I think, yeah, that's a massive one that you guys caught. And I do think the democratization of information within an organization, like not just self-help HR, but really almost like a flipping of the power dynamic where, now we're concerned about employee engagement and not just sort of recruitment, but engagement, keeping people engaged. And one of the ways that people are doing that is just involving employees in extraordinary ways.
Right. So for example, even though we went and visited the Stanford Design Center as we were writing this book and so on, I think one of the things that we missed was how human-centered design was going to transform how we think about designing experiences for HR and learning. So I think, and what that looks like, yeah. I think another, there's some things that maybe we're ahead of our time on, like electing the leader and so on. That didn't pan out much as we thought, but the emphasis on diversity has grown since we put this out. And I remember having reactions when we first published this where people said, oh, those will never happen. And now some of them I look at and think the ones that people were saying those will never happen are not necessarily the ones that didn't happen. So I remember working for companies, back in 2010, 2011, right when the book came out, and they said, you cannot use the phrase social media in this company. Never talk about social media in this company. That is never going to come into this company, which I think is, terribly funny.
I mean, even companies used to restrict people's access to the web because they were so concerned that, they would be shopping all day and not doing their work. It's extraordinary.
Well, there was this notion that they could control you, right? That somehow they had the power to control how employees operated in the workplace. And you think about that now and think how silly that sentence sounds, right? First of all, people work anywhere and everywhere they can. Many of them are no longer in corporate headquarters to begin with. And this notion that somehow, you can control someone is so outdated. So this social media, I think, has become almost like the air we breathe. I mean, like, we're not talking about it anymore because it's just a fabric of our lives.
And, one of the things, going back on the globalization, was, back then we were probably on the first version of the iPhone, and